I feel it might be useful for me to point out that my participation in first the creation of the World Health Organization and my role as Assistant Director General for 24 years. I attended every meeting of the World Health Assembly and every session of the Executive Board. The Executive Board met twice a year. The Health Assembly met annually. And I was present, exercising my functions at these meetings. I didn't miss a single one.
I first met Miltън Сийгъл when I was a graduate student working on my doctorate in public health at the University of Texas. Professor Sийгъл was on the faculty and was a teacher of mine those 4 years. Learning from him was always stimulating. He continually enriched his instruction with examples, almost little case studies or vignettes from his worldwide experiences in the field. Professor Sийгъл joined the World Health Organization, WHO, in 1946 when it was still in its formative stages, under the umbrella of the United Nations, created just the year before. Because of Sийгъл's earlier work in North Africa and the Middle East, he was asked, in effect, to be one of WHO's founding fathers. So he came on board on the senior staff of the Interim Commission. Dr. Brock Chisholm from Canada was the chairman of the Interim Commission. The Commission set up the permanent organization with headquarters in Geneva. Dr. Chisholm was chosen to be WHO's first Director General. Professor Sийгъл became Chisholm's key deputy almost immediately. I had not seen Professor Sийгъл for several years, though I've kept in close touch with him. The conversation you're about to hear was videotaped in Professor Sийгъл's home not long ago. Professor Sийгъл, how did Dr. Chisholm regard family planning in those early days as a potential concern for WHO?
Brock Chisholm was a realist, and he firmly believed that overpopulation was a threat, a security threat, if you will, to all the nations of the world. And steps must be taken, and it should be considered part of a health function that we do something about population control.
Did you and Brock Chisholm ever discuss the opposition inside WHO to family planning?
Yes, we had to, because it became an issue even before I joined the Interim Commission. I joined the Interim Commission a year after it was created.
When did you yourself first start witnessing this opposition to WHO involvement with family planning?
My first exposure to seeing this the initial stages of opposition to family planning by the Catholic Church started as soon as I joined the organization. Word reached me that this was a real problem, and I was visited by the representative, one of the representatives of the Vatican in Geneva, who wanted to know who I was and where I came from and what I believed in. And I politely invited him out of my office because I did not consider that I was under any obligation to reveal anything that I knew to someone outside the organization, whether it was the Vatican or any other group organized group. So that they couldn't get any information out of me. But as a result, I had to have the beginning of conversations with my colleagues, but particularly with Dr. Brock Chisholm, who was the Director General.
What was the basis of opposition within WHO to the discussion of population and population problems?
Well, the position simply was that population growth, family planning, or whatever you want to call it, was not a health problem, and therefore should not even be debated. That was the position of Ireland, Italy, Lebanon, and later on Belgium. The issue of population growth came up at every meeting WHO had. Population problems. You couldn't separate population problems from health. In the minds of most of the delegates. But these countries, particularly those that were dominated by the Vatican, didn't want to see that discussed in a health organization. Because as soon as you introduce anything under the subject of health, whether it's peace, security, or family planning, it's pretty hard to argue against improving the health of people. And these countries knew that, and they tried to defend themselves by saying these are political considerations and shouldn't be discussed in a health arena.
Wasn't the question of religion as such ever raised in the discussion?
Well, it was raised indirectly. Religion always was raised indirectly, one way or another. But sometimes they would simply call it politics. I think one can provide many illustrative examples of the way in which politics has interfered with the progress of health. And the influence of religion never did show itself until the Vatican began to use their influence through the Catholic Church organizational structure, which incidentally probably is one of the best organizational structures the world's ever seen. So that one way or another, perhaps surreptitiously, the Catholic Church used its influence to defeat, if you will, any movement toward family planning or birth control.
I've read and we've discussed that in the Second World Health Assembly, the representative from Ceylon commented that the security and peace of the world is threatened by population growth, and that the need for birth control must be considered internationally. What reaction was there to this?
Well, it's interesting to note the fact that the Second World Health Assembly was not in Geneva, it was in Rome. the environment under which we were subjected to in Rome for the Second World Health Assembly made it particularly difficult for anyone to make the kind of statement that was made by the men represented by the country that was then called Ceylon. But he still had the courage to get up and make that statement that he made about peace, the importance of peace and security and health, and the role that health can play with regard to population control or family planning, or what I choose to call management of population growth.
I recall how action was stymied at the Second World Health Assembly. What happened at the Third Assembly?
The Third World Health Assembly, which was back again in Geneva, where for the first time to my recollection, a strong effort was made in the steering committee to add the subject of population and family planning to the agenda to be discussed at the Third World Health Assembly. Well, the delegation of Ceylon was on the steering committee that drafted the agenda to go to the Health Assembly for approval, and they did their utmost to argue that population for them was exceedingly a serious problem, because they were a small island with relatively large population considering the size of the island, and they felt that population just had to be considered by the World Health Organization. And for that reason, he was making very strong efforts to get the steering committee to allow this subject of family planning, population, to be added to the suggested agenda. When that hit the Assembly for its approval of the agenda, it was the delegate from Ireland, J.D. McCormick, who made this rather strong, forceful statement in the style which was the one style he could handle extremely well. There were two major religions, and his country was one of them. That is, the major part of their population was one of the religions, which absolutely refused to permit their delegation to participate in any meeting where the problem of family planning was being discussed. But when the vote came on the subject of do we put population and family planning on the agenda, the vote was 30 against, 1 in favor, and there were somewhere between 4 and 6 abstentions.
So Ireland simply intimidated just about everyone, didn't they? While the Catholic opposition was developing earlier, how did Dr. Chisholm react Was he concerned?
Well, he was very concerned because he was beginning to feel the pressure from the member states of WHO that were predominantly Catholic in all respects, politically and in the development of their programs. And they were putting pressure on Brock Chisholm as Director General of WHO to do as little as possible about family planning. And then later on, as time went by, when they weren't very successful in influencing the development of the program, they became extremely difficult and put considerable pressure on the Director General to do nothing about family planning. And it took them about 3 years before they could get the kind of resolutions or consensus in our annual meetings of the Health Assembly to prevent the Director General from proposing programs which included such things as family planning.
It took who 3 years? Are you talking about the Catholic Church's representatives?
Well, they had to work through government representatives because they couldn't speak. They didn't have the prerogative of being recognized to speak at a meeting of the World Health Assembly or any of its subsidiary bodies unless they were invited. So they operated through the countries where they knew they had influence. And I think it's a well-known fact who those countries are. The two outstanding ones were Ireland and Italy. And then later on, the Belgians became very much involved. And it was the Belgians and the Irish delegations, chief delegates, that went to Brock Chisholm and demanded that he make a clear statement to the Assembly that he would not propose any family planning programs in any of the annual programs and budget of the organization. And they threatened him that if he didn't do that at the then ongoing Health Assembly, which was, I think, the third or fourth. The third assembly was in 1950 and the fourth was in 1951, where they threatened that they would withdraw from the organization and take steps to destroy the organization. They went so far as to use these words threatening him that if he didn't do what they wanted him to do, they would first withdraw and then they would create a new organization altogether and destroy the World Health Organization. And among the people he talked to was myself. Who else he talked to, I don't know. But I think I was the only one of his top policy makers that he discussed this with. And I told him that I did not consider that he should allow himself to be virtually blackmailed into taking the action they wanted him to take. Let him go ahead and withdraw and see what happens. Well, he did not want to do that because his term as Director General only had a couple more years to run, and he didn't want to leave that problem in the hands of whoever might be his successor, because he knew he was not going to remain for a second term as Director General, having already served 2 years as the Executive Director of the Interim Commission. So that he made a statement to the Health Assembly in full, complete session that he would not, as long as he was Director General, do anything to include family planning in the program of the organization. And that put a stop to anything that had been going on previously.
How very sad. At last, Chisholm felt he had to knuckle under.
Now, the only thing that was going on previously was a program in India which took place almost from the outset of the organization, because the then Minister of Health of India, who was a woman, not a doctor, who was formerly secretary to Mahatma Gandhi, and she was a converted Catholic, and she was dead set against any kind of family planning program in India. Even at that time, the Vatican would accept the idea of the use of the rhythm method, but no contraceptives. And we sent we provided an expert whose name I think was Abraham Stone to go to India to try to set up a program for the rhythm method, and he, together with the Minister of Health, whose name incidentally was the Rajkumari Amrit Kaur. She was a princess. That's what Rajkumari means. And I knew her quite well. And she was a charming person and was certainly a great supporter of WHO. But her being a converted Catholic made her more Catholic than the Pope. And she wasn't going to, she would refuse to support any kind of family planning program. When the rhythm method failed miserably, it produced absolutely no results. Then there was nothing left that was acceptable to her. It was only after she retired as Minister of Health that India began to do something about family planning. After what happened at the Third World Health Assembly, the Fourth World Health Assembly, which was in 1951 in Geneva, didn't even touch the subject. It was almost taken for granted that it would simply be a repetition of what happened at the Third, and therefore let's not waste time at the Fourth Health Assembly. And we get to the Fifth World Health Assembly. And see, that would have been, second was 49, third was 50, the fourth was 51, that'd be 52. 1952, the Fifth Health Assembly, which I have equated in my own mind as the death knell, the death bell of WHO's involvement in population, primarily because of the pressure put on the Director General by particularly the governments of Ireland and Belgium.
So I gather Dr. Chisholm's capitulation at the Third World Health Assembly wasn't quite the end of it, was it?
The representative of Ceylon at the Fifth World Health Assembly was Dr. Wickraman Singh, and in referring to the population problem said, "We must therefore always regard population problem as a vital one and see how, without violating any religious beliefs or moral standards, we could solve this problem in a scientific and careful manner." This then led to one of the outstanding members of the delegations that came to WHO meetings, who was Dr. Carl Evang from Norway. And the Scandinavian countries, as most people know, have almost always been in favor of doing something about family planning. This is particularly true with Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Dr. Carl Evang was an outstanding public health person in the world and spoke absolute perfect English. He proposed that after hearing what the representative from Ceylon had to say, that it was time to establish an expert committee to examine the problem and report on the health aspects of the population problem. His proposal met with the support of representatives of a number of countries, and I won't take time to list them. But of course one of them was Sweden, and another one was Ceylon. The group of countries that were under the influence of the Vatican, particularly, proposed another resolution that from a purely medical standpoint, population problems do not require any particular action on the part of WHO at the present time. In the meantime, the delegate from India, who I knew quite well, and incidentally he was a gynecologist and obstetrician from Madras, India, and he proposed a resolution that an expert committee should be set up with the aim of acquiring knowledge with regard to the spacing of children and birth control problems, as well as the other health aspects of population.
So 2 countries proposed expert committees.
After heated debate, discussion was closed, and it was time to put the resolutions to a vote. One of the members said he didn't understand what was taking place because, as he understood it, discussion of the subject had already been declared closed, and he didn't see why it should be reopened. The chairman of the committee, being mindful of what the problem was growing into, suggested that in the interest of harmony and conciliation, the best procedure would be to withdraw all the resolutions. And that was accepted by consensus.
What was the implication?
Well, the implication of that was that nothing happened, therefore, and the discussion was closed. There was no resolution, and therefore WHO, the Director General, already having made his statement that he would not include family planning in any program as long as he was Director General, but he only had another year or 2 to go anyway. Resulted in the organization doing absolutely nothing about family planning for a period of somewhere between 7 and 9 years. And that gave me an awful lot of problems, because every time I'd go to New York, I'd be jumped on by the United Nations because of WHO's failure to take what they considered to be the kind of action that WHO was the appropriate organization to deal with this. The failure of WHO to be able to do anything during this period to which I referred, 7 to 9 years, was clearly the result of the very effective job done by the Vatican and their representatives, not only at WHO, but at meetings of the UN and other organizations. The UN itself, the United Nations in New York, firstly by their Division of Social Affairs, tried to do something about the population problem, and were very disappointed that WHO had been placed in a position where they were virtually stopped, they were prevented from doing anything, which probably had a great deal of influence in the United Nations to the establishment of the United Nations Population Fund, which the United Nations people set up because WHO failed miserably to do what they had hoped WHO would do.
Professor Sийгъл, how do you feel about the situation there today? Do you think the Vatican still exerts pressure on WHO even today?
I believe that the Catholic Church still has considerable influence on WHO.